Hello, History 136 students. This is a very brief intro to World War I, and in particular, what made World War I different than previous wars. So part of what made the war different was scope. In just a moment, I'll show you a picture of the map of World War I in Europe that shows a little bit about why it was different. But it's important to keep in mind, this is a war that involves soldiers from every inhabited continent. And that means you have more people involved and simply larger scale movements than anything earlier. The experience of the soldiers was also different. Tactics and weapons made war dehumanizing, technological, and in many cases terrifying. Some of the outcomes of the war are truly disturbing. These same changes make the war different for civilians. The new weapons have much longer range, and the development of the tactic of total war means that, civilians are going to be starved as a general strategy of the war, along with soldiers. So it's an entire nation fighting, unlike older wars where it really was army versus army. This map gives you an idea of just what percentage of Europe is actually involved in the war directly. By the way, I should point out a couple things. Even countries that aren't directly fighting in the war, like say Spain, are still drawn in many ways. Spain produced something on the order of 12 million firearms for France, for example, making Spain one of the great weapons producing nations of the war, who did not actually fight in the war. That change, that sale, kicked off Spain's Industrial Revolution and greatly improved Spain's economy for years. The U.S. also sold a huge number of weapons to Great Britain, France, and Russia, amongst others. Actually, Greece and Serbia and Romania also bought weapons from the U.S. Much of America's industrial development post-1917 can be traced back to equipment purchased with money earned during World War I. Now, if you want to see more about World War I in vastly greater detail, I highly recommend the YouTube channel The Great War. They follow the war week by week in almost real time, starting 100 years after the war. So they're getting close to being at the end, but you can watch from the beginning. It's well worth a watch. Related to the Great War channel is See an Arsenal. This is one that's going to geek out on the technical details of military production and military weapons during World War I. If you're one of the many Battlefield 1 players, well, this will explain a lot about what's going on. And also, as a bonus, tell you a lot of the history of production, of industrial production in Europe. And part of the reason that's important is there had been a series of revolutions in weapons. Between 1860 and 1911, for example, rifles had gone through, depending on how you count them, 4 or 6 technological revolutions, and gone from being single-shot rifles that were loaded from the front with black powder to clip-fed repeating bolt-action rifles that fired smokeless powder and could fire about 5 times as fast. Also, they had a longer lifespan, they had a longer range. Basically, the new rifles were vastly superior. And also, they were so new that nobody had used them in a really large war where both sides had them. So their exact effect was not well known. Another weapon that dates back to the 1890s was the machine gun. About 20 years old at the beginning of the war, the machine gun was heavy and cumbersome, difficult to carry around. They weighed nearly 100 pounds all put together and took very heavy ammunition and lots of it. But they were remarkably effective. Now, because they're so heavy and difficult to move around, it does mean that defenders in World War I generally have an advantage over attackers. That advantage is increased by the tendency to build trenches. World War I's artillery was very effective. Machine guns and rapid-fire rifles all meant that any soldier caught out in the open was as good as dead. So, soldiers had to dig trenches. The life in trenches was extremely unpleasant. You never knew when artillery would drop at you. Snipers from the other side would shoot at you whenever they got the chance. And, as we'll see in a moment, airplanes could fly over at any moment dropping bombs. But even worse is the fact that the environment was out to get you. If for troops who were in a place like France, they faced an environment very similar to Illinois. And that means that in, say, November, you're in a place that is wet and muddy, standing in cold water for hours or even days at a time. This is not a healthy situation. And that leaves aside the fact that when you attacked, you would jump out of the trenches in a huge charge involving thousands or tens of thousands of men and charge at machine guns, leaving fields of dead bodies. And you had to worry, for the first time in history, about what was above you. Heavier than aircraft had been developed and used in warfare for the first time, and bombers could range as far as 100 miles and carry as much as a ton of explosives. Even longer ranged and capable of carrying even more bomb load are Zeppelins, lighter than aircraft that have been developed. They may seem extremely fragile, and they would be today, but these Zeppelins could fly so high that none of the airplanes of the time could fly high enough to attack them. They could carry tons of bombs, and guns on the ground couldn't fire high enough to hit them, so they were invulnerable. And they could fly thousands of miles. Not quite far enough to cross the Atlantic and attack the U.S., although some plans were made with the idea of doing that, but they could certainly fly from Germany over France entirely and bomb London, as this picture shows. These small figures here and here give you an idea of the kind of devastation just one of, I believe it's 35 bombs that was carried in this particular Zeppelin raid. Another new device that made the war more impersonal and more devastating on a larger scale is the U-boat. This is a German submarine. Submarines had actually been developed during the American Civil War in a very, very limited sense. But by World War I, very efficient submarines had been developed. The Germans used them to blockade England. Now, blockading is a tactic where you cut off an enemy nation from bringing supplies in. Technically, according to international law, you were supposed to allow humanitarian goods. So medicines, bandages, things like that. But not weapons. This becomes important because U-boats could not board and check out a cargo ship to make sure it's only carrying the approved equipment. They had a small crew, and they're quite fragile. And the English very quickly realized if they put a gun on their cargo ships, even a very small one, then the U-boats couldn't fight it out with them. So the U-boats would have no choice but to sink every ship they saw heading for an enemy country with torpedoes, giving the crew very little chance of escaping. And seeming to neutral countries, particularly like the U.S., like a very barbaric way of fighting indeed. But a very effective way. Between February and July of 1917, German U-boats sank 4 million tons of shipping. To put this into perspective, during that period, you could go to any place on the eastern coast of North America, from Florida to the Arctic Circle, and see the smoke from a burning ship on the horizon. Any place at all. The U.S. responded, once it joined the war, with typical American tactics. One of them was applying Henry Ford's moving production line on a grand scale to building building ships. In this case, destroyers. American ships, American yards could turn out a destroyer in about 6 weeks, start to finish. British yards took a year and a half. This gave America 350 destroyers to use to fight the U-boat menace, fairly quickly ending the danger from U-boats and making the passage from the U.S. and, crucially, Canada to England and France safe. That's not the only weapon that made the war dehumanizing. The development of tanks gave lumbering mechanical monstrosities. Early tanks, developed by the French and English, were particularly ineffective. This particular one is French and was both heavy and slow and got stuck an awful lot. Germany could only build a handful of tanks. Their tanks were even worse. This one, the A7V, was the only tank they actually built during the war and used in combat. The size and shape of a double-decker bus, it carried 25 men and frequently got stuck. The only one that survives is Wotan in this picture. But the French and English quickly developed a second generation of tanks that were more effective. America used the so-called Liberty tanks, which were small and cheap and relatively quick, although they did only move 5 miles an hour. But they could be produced in large numbers and proved crucial to ending the war. If you want to see one, there is a old World War I tank used as a statue in Miller Park in Bloomington. I'm going to make another video that talks a little bit about some other topics for the war, but that'll be coming a little later on.